I was always told that God is not a man that he should lie. And how do we know that? Well, because it's in a book or compilation of books that are purported to be the Word of God, even though everybody knows that every book of the Bible was written by men, men who lie. So, what does that mean about God? Does God lie? God only knows, because all anyone knows about God is from a book written by men pretending to speak for God, a God who can never speak for himself. So, how do we know that that's really what they're doing? That they're just pretending to speak for God? Well, let's look at the book of Job, for example. Therein, God says that the sea is shut up behind doors, and that the earth is a flat disk in the shape of clay when pressed by a seal, and that it has edges that you can grab and shake the evil off of it. And God says he laid a foundation for the earth, and he erected pillars on it, and then he took the earth, presumably by the edges, and then sat atop those pillars. And God also says that the sun will not rise unless he commands it to, because God doesn't know what the sun is, nor where it is, nor how big it is, nor does he know the true shape of the earth either. He doesn't know that he's got everything round backwards, that the earth goes around the sun and not the other way around. This isn't just some Bronze Age moron raving about what he thinks the voices in his head are trying to tell him. No. We are expected to believe that this is God speaking directly to Job in person.
Hey, this is Rybot. I used to watch Aaron Ra's videos back in the day. I think 2001ish, back when YouTube was still young and everybody everybody was talking about religion and stuff. Christopher Hitchens was doing the rounds. The other horsemen of the apocalypse. We had Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and Dan Dennett, and then Ray Comfort. What were their other names? Ted Haggart. All these guys, and I came out of that kind of doing my own research, just forgetting what everybody else was saying on both sides about uh, what religion is and what religion teaches. And one thing I noticed about the biblical scholars, now I'm not a believer in, I don't identify with Christianity or with any other religion, although I do find them all very interesting. One thing about uh, the Bible is that they're often referred to as the inspired works of God. So, what I understand that to mean is that the authors of the books in the Bible were inspired by some knowledge of God, and they derived their conclusions and their allegories from that knowledge. So he's going to talk about the Genesis story later on, and I think that's kind of the foremost allegory in the Bible. And Aaron admits that it's an allegory and that many people miss that point of view. Again, I'm not here to defend what everybody else thinks, but more or less to give a broader context to these things, from what I've been exposed to. So I don't know that any of the epistemic. First of all, I don't know that the epistemic aspects of the Bible are exactly epistemic claims, or if they're not allegory in some cases. Sometimes they may be epistemic claims, and in other cases they may be allegory. One thing that the Catholic Church says is that some of the stories in the Bible, if not the whole Bible, is a collection of allegory, and that they have this concept of anagogy, which is kind of going from the literal to the analogical to, or literal to allegorical to analogical to anagogical interpretation. And I guess what that means is that there's a literal story which could be interpreted literally, and in some ways has to be interpreted literally in order to even derive or glean the allegorical meaning of it, um, and the analogical meaning, and then the anagogical meaning. And there's some slight distinctions between them, but the anagogical meaning is effectively like a metaphysics, like a metaphysical understanding of reality, or an ontological understanding, perhaps. Um, Something that goes beyond the elements of the story, and really the story is circumstantial to this anagogical interpretation. So that's something that I think about when I'm reading sections of religious text, whether it's the Bible or the Quran or the Bhagavad Gita. I think the Gita is another great example of this type of thing where there's this epic story, but within that story is kind of this metaphysical reality that's being portrayed. And perhaps the characters Arjuna, Krishna, perhaps these characters represent certain aspects of that metaphysics, but otherwise they're not really that important. And I find that this is a rather common theme in religion, not just in Christianity. Christianity, or the Abrahamic faiths, are peculiar in the sense that I think there's a lot more people that believe they are literal. Meanwhile, like, yeah, Hinduism has a lot of literal interpretation in it. Um, when you get into things like Buddhism and Taoism, not so much, although there are adepts at both those schools that believe in some literal things. But sticking with, you know, the quote unquote mystic interpretations, later on in this video, he refers to Jesus as a mystic. Sticking with the mystic interpretations of like Ibn Arabi, Ibn al Haytham, um, Shabastari, Rumi, Guru Nanak, these types of figures, there's very little focus on the literal interpretations. They're not presented as literal stories, they're presented as allegories. And whereas in Christianity, much more of it is taken literally. Whether that means that that's how it was intended or not is debatable. But let's listen a little bit more here.
albeit disguised as a whirlwind. Because remember that people back then didn't know that air was particulate matter. They thought that air was a supernatural spirit that gave us the breath of life. And when things moved because of the wind or whatever, whether they're clouds or a whirlwind or what have you, then they thought all of that was supernatural and an animating spiritual life force. You really should read the book of Job. And God says some really stupid things in that book.
I don't know if see, I can't rhyme it all off by heart, especially the Book of Job. But I don't know that there is a clear distinction in the minds of the biblical authors between the physical ordered universe and God. That God is somehow supervening on it, involved in it. The universe is identified as God, but God is still something more than that. Um, if you look at the Egyptian Aten worship, same kind of thing, right? I mean, it's focused on the sun, but you get the distinct impression from reading Akhenaten's hymn to the Aten that what he means by the sun is much more, or what he means by Aten is much more than just the sun, but something that is that permeates everything. And I guess my question is, at this point in human history, did did human beings conceive of something like a universe or reality or existence, this kind of set to contain all sets, or this ontologically superior reality, this thing that encapsulates everything, whether that's a universe or multiverse or cosmos or nature or the Buddha, the Tao, God, right? Did Were these, maybe some of these terms, synonymous with each other? Like, are we bringing a modern context to bear on ancient thinking, where we're separating out physical happenings from God's doing? Or another question, let's put it this way: in ancient Greece, they believed, many philosophers believed, that reason and speech were closely related. So if you were mute or unable to speak, like say you had Broca's aphasia or something, so you're unable to form comprehensive speech, then that meant that you were stupid. Whereas now we draw a distinction and we say, because we know that people who have Broca's aphasia are not stupid, that they just have difficulty with composing speech. But then at that time, they didn't see the distinction, so they presumed certain things to be equal to each other. Like, for example, God's word, is that a literal, is that speech, or is that something else like causality? Is it something like, God said, "Let there be light," and then there was light. He didn't literally say, "Let there be light," but his what's attributed to speech from God is actually the act of something happening. Um, that's an interesting form of allegory that I believe is used through many religions. Um, and that's where we get these images, is kind of like based in this lack of distinction between things like speech, logic, and causality, and then the anthropomorphism, or the allegorical representation of trying to say, here's this ontologically superior thing within which all things exist, and we're a mirror representation of that in some way, where our speech is logically consistent with something like causality. So we have the like this threefold view of causality, logic, reason, logic and reason being pretty much the same thing, and then speech, and speech being kind of like the reflection of causality. And what makes me think that that is actually a more pervasive idea that in ancient Christianity, or in the Catholic Church, or in even with respect to some thinkers like Martin Luther, is well, first of all, the concept of anagogy to begin with, um, and then lost my train of thought there. But then the idea that like John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word, sometimes translated as logos. They're treated as though they're the same thing. Another we'll get into once we get to the story of Genesis. I think it will make a lot more sense.
Now, seriously, every argument is so bad and so dumb, they could only be the words of mere fallible men who didn't know anything about the world around them, pretending to speak for God. Because if it really was God, he would
And that actually I agree with that there's probably quite a bit of ignorance there, that if they were trying to give an empirical claim about the way things work, um, the ordered nature of the universe, if they were attempting to make an empirical claim about that, then they may have been going off their own intuition, which was inspired by their knowledge or understanding of God. And then because of that, they were mistaken, and they thought they were giving it an objective account of things, but they were actually just mistaken because they were inspired. They weren't speaking directly on God's behalf. They weren't relaying a message. They were inspired to think this way by their understanding, but they were in fact wrong about it.
Would have known better than everything they said there. And no real God could be as stupid as the Bible makes him out to be. But here's the problem: biblical literalists are also bibliolaters. They worship the Bible as God because they think that to disprove the Bible is to disprove God. If the Bible's wrong, then God is wrong. They can't distinguish doctrine from deity. So,
This is something that I always took issue with when thinking while talking to people who believe in religion, is the idea that truth is somehow tied to an individual or tied to a book or a statue or something like that. Like somehow you need this book in order to find God, or you need Jesus in order to find God. And I've always thought that's peculiar. It sounds to me like what is also described as idolatry. This idea that God, exists in a certain place, but that's it. Jesus himself is recorded saying, look in the sky and you'll find me there. Look under a stone and you'll find me there. So it seems to contradict that statement that God would be attached to a particular book or something like that. And I'm more or less of the thinking that, as a perennialist, that the truth exists and that various cultures, using their iconography, using their language, using their kind of built-in mythos, have generated stories based off of this inspiration, and that's what we're finding in religion. And then science is kind of like another story or another mode of interacting with the truth, which which agreeably has greater efficacy and application in terms of its proving epistemic claims, its proving of its ability to predict outcomes and certain events. It's definitely got a lot more potency in that regard, but I also think it has just as much potency in the sort of mystic or metaphysics side of things. When we look at neuroscience, for example, or we look at astrophysics, for example, or cosmology, or even evolution, I see those things as kind of validating or reproving some of the mystic interpretations of religion, the people that I mentioned before, but also in Christianity, people like Meister Eckhart, people like Thomas Merton, Saint John of the Cross, um, like those types of people. When you listen to their interpretation, it does line up with modern physics and modern neuroscience in particular. We can get into that after the Genesis story. The Genesis story is really important to me explaining this.
here's the situation: either God is lying about the disk of the earth, for example, or God is stupid and he doesn't know that the earth is really spherical. In which case, this is a very small God who is also lying about having created the earth. Or, and this is infinitely more likely than any other option, the Ignorant primitives who wrote that part of the Bible were lying about what God did or said. And faced with that logical conundrum where there is no reasonable salvation of Scripture at all, the die-hard believer is forced to concede that's it. That settles it. Earth is flat. It's one thing to get something wrong, like when Jesus said that the mustard seed was the smallest of all seeds, even when contemporary farmers in his area already knew of a few other seeds that were smaller than that. And how was Jesus supposed to know? He wasn't a farmer. He didn't even know when figs were in season.
These are fair points, and I think of like the fourth century Muslim scholar Ibn al-Haytham, who I mentioned earlier, that mapped out the rudimentary components of the optic system and basically contributed to the foundations of the scientific method. And al-Haytham's believed that the ordered universe was identical to the works of God, and that by studying the optic system, he was studying God, and that God was in these ways discoverable, but that our own minds had a tendency to deceive themselves, to lead us astray, and he was interested in devising a method to kind of clarify how God operates in the world. And so by developing these methods of empirical inquiry, he was able to do that with the optic system. And while he may not have been 100% correct in his analysis, his belief system allows for that because just like science, it allows for him being wrong but making epistemic claims that are falsifiable, um, and still attributing those claims to God.
Jesus was a carpenter, supposedly, although the way he talked and the analogies that he used were always had to do with stoneworking and was suspiciously Masonic. Is Jesus secretly a Freemason?
This hypothesis is not actually totally unrealistic. The Masons are frequently linked to Solomon. Uh, Solomon himself is a very interesting person, very interesting author, and diverged from the typical Christianity that you'd find then, just as Paul did, because they were influenced more by paganism and Greco-Roman philosophy. And Solomon, he uses these terms like Sophia so frequently, where the um, the four canonical gospels, the disciples Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, don't speak in that way. So what's interesting about Solomon is that he's speaking from within a different context, but still believing the same things, or believing that he believes the same things. And the you know the Council of Nicaea, where they kind of agreed on and composed the canonical books of the Bible, they also saw or believed that Solomon and St. Paul had the same beliefs as Jesus and the four disciples. And that's really interesting, I think. Also, during that time, I think it was around the 4th century AD, possibly earlier, we had figures like Clement of Alexandria, who wholeheartedly believed that the Greco Roman philosophy, the philosophy of Plato, the philosophy of Aristotle, and thinkers like that were kind of a different way of approaching the same underlying truth as Christianity. And that's an important theme I'd like to touch on there, that in early Christianity there are people who from both the Greco-Roman side, the pagans and the Christians, who saw similar truths within each other, and some of them even adopted both belief systems, like Clement of Alexandria.
In any case, what Jesus said about the size of a mustard seed is not necessarily a lie, it's just a mistake, an oversight of ignorance. But what he said about the size of a mustard seed in relation to the amount of faith that would be needed to engage telekinetic powers to lob mountains into the sea, was that a lie? It obviously isn't true, because in the thousands of years since then, we've had millions of fervent believers who are firmly committed, or should be committed, who tried to do things like this, yet none of them ever caused a tsunami with the power of their wishful thinking.
I do think just but like I'm not 100% familiar with this story, but just based on the way he's telling it, it does sound like allegory to me. It sounds like, moving mountains. Um, I've personally thought, like, I've been so enamored by a girl that I thought to myself, I would split the earth in half to be with her, or I would easily leap over mountains to be with her. It's the idea of throwing mountains into the ocean just because you have a strong conviction in something doesn't sound to me like an epistemic claim. It sounds to me like um, it's more or less saying that if with this kind of conviction you can accomplish great things.
But what about when Jesus pretends to cast demons into pigs? Well, I agree with what Lincoln said, that it is an established maxim in morals that he who makes an assertion without knowing whether it is true or false is guilty of falsehood, and the accidental truth of the assertion does not justify or excuse him. It is dishonest to assert baseless speculation as if it were a matter of fact, like making up your own statistics on the fly.
I absolutely agree with this. One of my favorite epistemologists is Willem Kingdon Clifford, who believed that it's just effectively a sin to claim something based off of insufficient evidence. To simply shoot from the hip at truth is effectively a sin. You should be, because of your own narcissism, because of um, your own quote unquote sinfulness or delusion, your propensity to believe in falsehood, um, requires that you are skeptical of yourself and that you're doing your due diligence and determining what the truth is. Now, there's, William James and Susan Hack argue the opposing point of view and to say that, there's no possible way that you could be ever 100% sure. I think with certain, logical axioms like law of identity, the law of non contradiction, that kind of thing, you can be pretty sure. But when it when it comes to a lot of other claims like what we're talking about here, yeah, it's difficult to have that level of certainty. Nevertheless, everybody should do their due diligence to arrive at that level of certainty.
That's what all religions do. That's what faith is all about, pretending to know things you don't know. In fact, that's the very falsehood that gives you this promised power. If you could just make believe hard enough, if you believe you can fly, then you can fly, or you'll die because it's a lie.
This is what a lot of people like Christians. Basically, my whole family are Christians, save a couple of people that have basically abandoned religion entirely. They're not too interested in science either. I think they've just abandoned their own mind or something. But a lot of the Christians in my family do make this claim that it's just a matter of believing that all you got to do is believe, and they absolutely outright reject any interpretation that I present to them that contradicts that. But I would uh, I would point back to Solomon again and Solomon's conviction in Proverbs that um, you can, if you incline your ear to wisdom and incline your heart to understanding, that you can find the knowledge of God. And that is what he says. He doesn't say believe blindly. in God, he says to focus on wisdom and understanding and find the knowledge of God. So for Solomon, he seems to believe that there's something more there than just belief or just faith, that there is some kind of metaphysical claim that can be tested and proven to oneself. And other people may not accept it, but given the right kind of thinking, that you can prove it to yourself. And these statements are given as eligible for reproof. So it's not as if Solomon is expecting the reader to just take his word for it, but he actually wants the reader to think about it and be skeptical about it. And I would also say about Solomon in the same Proverbs, I think Proverbs 2, he says that I believe it opens with for interpreting the riddles and sayings of the wise. And I think what he's referring to there is the Old Testament writings and those of the Gospels, and in fact the red text, right, the sayings attributed to Jesus, that they are riddles and sayings, similitudes and allegory. So he is referring to them in that way, and enjoining the reader to think about them that way and to think critically, find the hidden wisdom and understanding within them that would lead them to God. So, based on that, I don't see that it's a unanimous perspective in Christianity that everything is just based on blind belief or faith. There are certainly a lot of people who think that, but there is some um, biblical evidence there that early Christians didn't really think that way.
Now, in all fairness, Jesus didn't always pretend to know things he didn't know. Remember when he told his followers how they would be able to see him returning in the clouds at the right hand of power? You remember when he said that would happen? He didn't know when that would happen. He said he hoped that it wouldn't be in winter because he didn't know that when it's winter in one hemisphere that it's summer in another, well, he wasn't here for the whole world anyway, so I guess it doesn't matter. Remember that he thought that if you climbed to the top of a high mountain or a stupidly tall tree, that you'd be able to see all of the kingdoms of the earth, which is only possible if the world was flat, just as he and his dad both thought. But it doesn't matter whether he could see all the kingdoms of the earth because he wasn't here for all the kingdoms. He was only here for the Jews.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of stuff again. For literalists about the Bible, well, first of all, we run into the problem of Solomon talking about riddles and sayings, and how Jesus also talks about speaking in parables. He says, "Therefore, speak I unto them in parables, so that seeing they will not see, hearing they will not hear, and neither will they understand. And in them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah." There's a whole lot to unwrap there in that just that one statement. But if we just take that at face value and take what Solomon's saying at face value as a literalist, then we can't really be literalists, right? Because the whole point of a parable is that it's not literal.
And the point is that Jesus admitted when he knows things or when God knows things that Jesus doesn't know because God and Jesus are different people and Jesus is subordinate to God. Jesus thought that he and Big Daddy would come back real soon. Matter of fact, he said he would be back very soon, while at least some of his apostles were still alive. He said that. Certainly he was going to come back during their generation, before that generation passed. But that whole generation has been dead for 19 centuries already, and he never came back at all.
This is one thing, like the resurrection, the second coming, that I wonder if it's been kind of dramatized beyond its efficacy of what its intention was. Because again, once we get to Genesis, I think things will be a little bit clearer. But unfortunately, that's not until 20 minutes into the video. But what I'm thinking is that, in Catholicism, if you read the Palm Sundays of Pope Benedictus XVI, which is not going back too far, but I haven't really been paying much attention to the Pope since then. But he had these Palm Sundays where he addressed concerns by things raised by Meister Eckhart's philosophy, which he absolutely rejected. Although the reasons why he rejected it are not exactly clear to me. They almost sound like the same thing, his rejections and Eckhart's philosophy. But one thing he said was that Christ is creative reason. Christos is creative reason. So it's not clear to me that when Jesus is referring to himself, that he is referring to himself as a man or as a body. But if he isn't more or less identifying with the orderly structure of the universe and the rational capacity of the human mind to ascertain the orderly structure of the universe and the metaphysical truth that is implied by it. And in that way, Jesus coming back is kind of like him being vindicated, or not him as a person being vindicated, but him as the embodiment of creative reason or of reason or logic. If he is the embodiment of those things, then his second coming would be the vindication of that as more people accept it and believe it. Then he is kind of reborn in them in their understanding.
It's like that night when your dad went out and said he was just going to go get cigarettes. You remember him? So Jesus didn't know any more than the other people of his day, and he probably understood even less than a lot of them. Because remember, he was a superstitious mystic and a faith healer who believed that diseases were caused by demons.
Um, this term mystic gets a bad rap, really. I think when you take a critical look at who the mystics were, like Al Ghazali, uh, Shabastari, these people didn't believe in superstition necessarily. They believed in reason and rational thought and deducing logically what is true. I would say that, not to kind of spoil things here, but a lot of their thinking is similar to the Jains or similar to um, the non dualists, like this Advaita school in Hinduism, Advaita Vedanta, the concept of non duality. Uh, Buddha's Nagarjuna, for example, Nagarjuna's famous negative dialectic, or the philosophy of Hegel, the concept of synthesis, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, and how you can kind of, starting from one proposition, come up with an anti-proposition, find a synthetic proposition that kind of binds those two into a singular domain, and then from there you can uh, kind of ascend to a higher understanding. And perhaps this is what is meant partially by the anagogical, is this ascent to a higher understanding. You're starting with kind of two seemingly opposite concepts, but then finding a common thread within them, and that brings you to a higher understanding. It's like Hammurabi famously believed that Hesperus and Phosphorus were two separate celestial objects, and he believed that one was the morning star, one was the evening star, when in fact both of them were the planet Venus. But from Hammurabi's perspective, they appeared to be two different things. It wasn't until much later that people realize that both of these objects were a single object. Or put otherwise, um, in debates about human development, or even evolution, for example, we tend to think in a dichotomous way. We think that human development is determined either by genetics or by socialization. It's either determined by genes or by environment. And in more recent years, we've come to understand that these two factors interplay with each other in such a coordinated, concrete way that you can't really separate them. It's very difficult to separate them. The field of epigenetics kind of bridges the gap between environment and genetics, and other factors, right, like teratogens that affect fetal development, various other toxins that affect an individual postnatally. There's a number of ways in which the gene expression is mediated by the environment, which means that the ultimate outcome of fetal development is not solely either or, but is actually both in all cases. And similarly, if we were to separate the world into black and white, we could synthesize the domain of luminance. We could say that there is no black and white without each other, and thus both make up the domain of luminance, or of shade, if you want to call it that. And this is kind of like Wittgenstein's law of contradiction, right? The idea that for any proposition P is implied a proposition not P, and that because of this, the proposition P and the proposition not P form the actual identity of P. And this is simply bringing Aristotle's law of identity and Aristotle's law of non-contradiction into focus, and what that means, right? For the law of identity states that a thing is what it is. The law of non-contradiction states that a thing cannot be what it isn't. And what Wittgenstein did was he said, because of that link in identity between a thing being what it is and not being what it isn't, that this whole domain of identity is the thing itself, that there is more than just these two opposites, that these two opposites are contained within this kind of domain of perception, if you will. So that's kind of like the non-dual thought, or the negative dialectics of the Jains and Nagarjuna, this rejection of these concrete objects, and a more critical thinking about how those objects relate to each other, and what that means as like a more higher understanding of things, right?
All of that could be a sign of stupidity. He might really have believed it, since he obviously had no understanding of logical reason or rational.
So to finish my point there, this is what I get from the mystics when I read the mystical interpretations of, if I said Guru Nanak, or even the mystical Christians. What I understand is that they're making more or less appeal to a form of Hegelian synthetics, or Wittgenstein's law of contradiction, which is reasonable. And I don't think you can say that the mystics are superstitious or unreasonable, given that that's what their focus is. And they focus on it in a slightly different way. They focus on it in terms of something like no self, non-duality, saying that I and the Father are one, that we are, although we seem to be separate, we are actually one and the same, that we're kind of two ends of the same domain, and that there is no identity in one without the other.
Rational skepticism. Not a lot of people did back then, or now either, sadly. Ignorance is no excuse, at least not every time, because it was also that time when Jesus admitted that he was being deliberately deceptive, misleading his audience with purposefully confusing parables. That is an admission of deception. That was Jesus' confession that he was lying to those people.
So I would say here that this can go two ways. I've thought of this as being an act of deception, but I've also thought about when the Buddha says the same thing. He says, if I was to explain the truth plainly and clearly and people misunderstood it, I'd be wasting my time because people would just reject it. But if I wrap it in a parable so that people, whether they believe it or not, at least it's an interesting kind of story or something to think about, then perhaps they will realize the underlying truth of it eventually. It's like telling a child a fable or an allegory that they may not immediately understand, but as they develop and as they kind of repeat this story in their mind, they may eventually glean the underlying moral principles or truths about that statement. So I don't know that Jesus' intention was to deceive or confuse people as much as it was to kind of spread his message without it being flatly rejected, and providing people with some kind of riddle for them to figure out made it more transmissible.
And when Christians hear that, they like to say, well, of course he lied about that because it was justified because they weren't going to believe him anyway, so it's fine. No. It's funny how believers defend lying. They've often said to me, what's wrong with lying? And why does it have to be true before I believe it? I mean, I remember the father of Protestant Christianity, Martin Luther, said, what harm would it do if if you lie for Jesus, essentially? And I don't know why you would want to believe something that isn't true, but they do.
Martin Luther is an interesting character to bring up, but what I want to add something to that. Jesus and his parables. He didn't speak in parables to everybody. He spoke plainly to his disciples. In that same passage, I believe you'll see, for you it is given, but for them it is not given. So he's explaining to his disciples why he speaks to the general public in parables, and then he speaks to them plainly. They know the plain truth, but he's not sharing that with other people because they're not prepared to hear it. They wouldn't understand it and they would just flatly reject it. But by explaining it in parables, at least they have some kind of stories they can tell. And there's another element to it, which maybe we'll get into a bit later, which is that people are more apt in general to believe in these kinds of parables, fantasy stories. People are more likely to believe in ghosts than other things like um, the futility of their own existence, right? If you said to somebody, a lot of people, if you take, for example, the free will debate, if you can present all kinds of logical arguments as to why free will isn't true, and a large number of people will still choose to believe in free will despite any kind of rational justification. I mean, they'll come up with reasons, but really it's not reason, because reason is so closely tied in with things like causality. It's really not reason that's motivating them to believe in their free will. It's their own self, their own desire for power or control or something that's influencing that. Um, so to give somebody a story that they're inclined to believe in kind of helps get a foot in the door, gets through the gate.
A few of them have even admitted that what they believe is not really true, but they're going to believe it anyway. One believer recently criticized me for rejecting what he called proof of creation, or proof of God, rather. He didn't have any evidence, of course, no logical syllogisms or anything like that. He expected me to believe what he believed simply because he said so. And he got mad at me for pointing out that his claim or argument or fact and evidence or whatever he has cannot qualify as proof if he can't even show that it's true.
As we go into this, I'm going to have a hard time avoiding my Genesis interpretation for the next 10, 12 minutes. Yeah, I think it's absolutely true. There's a lot of people out there that, for one reason or another, form a sense of self or a self concept around a particular set of beliefs, particularly when it comes to religion and Christianity. There are a lot of people that form a sense of self around that within a community of Christianity, within a community of people who believe the same thing. And having thus constructed their sense of self, there's not going to be very much that's going to shake them off of that, besides maybe relocating to a whole new environment where other people don't share the same beliefs. Like if somebody was to leave Utah and go and live in India for a while, they might come back with a different perspective. But as long as they remain in Utah surrounded by other Mormons, it's going to be difficult or unlikely for that individual to kind of detach themselves from that sense of identity that they have as a Mormon.
Faulty premise is not proof, but I guess it can be if you believe that it is. I'm just not a pretender.
I think the same is true for atheists as well. And to be clear, I in the past I have identified as an atheist, although now for that same reason as what I just described, I don't think it's necessarily useful to identify as anything, to attach myself or to use um, a social category, a philosophical category, or something as a personal identifier. I'm more closely aligned to like some type of, quote unquote mystic perennialist, but I still don't really think that identifying with those terms has any value to me. For one, it will make me more likely to defend those belief systems and other people who identify as that. And I already know that I don't agree with all of the people that have the label mystic attached to them. And I don't agree with all of the perennialists. There's a lot of disagreement between perennialists like Schuon and Huxley, and I don't personally identify with them or the term perennialist, but I see value in what the term perennial implies, that there is a kind of a truth that flowers in different cultures at different times, but it's the same underlying truth. Well, I could disagree with that everybody about what that truth is, and that's why I don't identify necessarily as a perennialist. If you said perennialists are all ridiculous, superstitious mystics, it's not going to offend me. Just think like maybe maybe you're doing that out of malice or something. Maybe you're doing that because it conflicts with your personal identity, um, or maybe you genuinely think that based off of the information that you have. In any case, none of it really has anything to do with me, and so I don't, I'm not going to take offense to that. Same as saying that, well, everything else that he says in this video doesn't really offend me. I agree with it in one context when we're talking about biblical literalism and kind of the, I guess, Southern Baptist perspective of Christianity. But I want to point out, because you mentioned Martin Luther, I think it is very peculiar that Martin Luther wrote this book called On the Bondage of the Will, in which he rejected the concept of free will. He attributed all causality to God, he attributed all existence to God, and human beings were simply a manifestation of that, God of God. It's peculiar that Martin Luther believed this. He's widely considered to be the father of the Protestant Reformation, and yet all throughout Protestantism, you have the exact opposite. You have people who believe that they have free will and that the path to liberation is to just believe in Christ. Martin Luther's point of view seems radically different than that. So I think this is just more evidence that people can follow a spiritual leader, but not really follow them. Like they pick and choose what they want to embrace, and other things they kind of ignore. Now, John Calvin didn't ignore the concept of determinism in Christianity, and John Calvin and the Calvinists today reject the concept of free will. But the vast majority of Reformed Christians believe in this version of free will, and I want to point out how the path to liberation or um, revelation or whatever you call it differs between these two groups. Another kind of mystic text, if you want to call it that, is the Theologia Germanica, which is I think circa 1400 A.D. By an unknown author, and it really kind of pushes this idea that there is no human being apart from God. There is no self that's in control. That any focus on I, me, mine is erroneous. And not just the idea that I have free will, but the idea that I exist independently of God is erroneous. And that really any thought of I is a problem. It's a fundamental mistake. And this is an epistemic mistake. It's an epistemic claim. This is not based on faith or anything like that. This is simply saying that any concept of I being separate from God is an error. And we can imagine how a negative dialectic, a Hegelian dialectic, or Wittgenstein's law of contradiction could play into this way of thinking, that there is no separation of identity between I and God, and in fact, both are two ends of the same domain. And this is where concepts of Trinity and stuff like that come into play as well, because you have the concept of the I as it relates to God, and then the domain of relationship, which is also attributed to God. So you have I guess you would say something like the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, the being from, being for, and being with, that Pope Benedictus XVI refers to in his Palm Sundays in rejection of Meister Eckhart's understanding. So the Pope rejects Meister Eckhart's understanding on the basis of this fundamental, he says, this fundamental anthropological pattern, which is the being with, being from, and being for. Meanwhile, Meister Eckhart claims that the eye that I see God with is the same eye that God sees me with. So Meister Eckhart's is also a rejection of I as separate from God, and then an acknowledgement of this kind of anthropological pattern. So this is why I say I don't really see why the Pope is disagreeing with Meister Eckhart, but he is, and maybe that's just because of his ego or something, where he wants to somehow reject some, or he just wants to reject some of Eckhart's conclusions. I think the main conclusion that he wants to reject of Eckhart is the claim that if we all overcame or any individual overcame their ego to the extent that they fully identified with God, that they would be the same as Christ, that they would have the same status as Jesus Christ. And in Christianity, there's a large element that wants to maintain this concept of divinity and specialness of Christ. That means that none of us could ever actually attain to that. But that is not a universal concept that was debated at the Council of Nicaea. The Arian controversy, Arian famously did not believe in this doctrine of Christ's divinity. I believe John Duns Scotus was another one, and certainly I know that Soren Kierkegaard also rejected this idea that Christ was in some kind of unattainable status. He uh, he wrote in Christian theology, or sorry, practicing Christianity, that if God, if Jesus, if God became man to lead us to salvation, he became man to provide the example of how to be saved, then it would be a meaningless exercise. It would be an exercise in vanity if we were not fundamentally the same as Jesus and capable of going through the same process of salvation as Jesus did. So Kierkegaard rejects this idea because this idea of Christ's divinity on the basis that if Christ was so different from us, then his example would be meaningless.
And believers don't have a problem with lying. Everything they believe is a lie, and defenders of the faith know that they know exactly what lies they have to tell at what cues in order to conceal, confuse, and deny the truth. But the ends don't justify the means. Just because the people Jesus was talking to didn't believe in his truth doesn't justify lying to them. As street preacher Ray Comfort always says,
Have you ever lied? So if you've lied, what does it make you? It makes you a liar.
even according to Christians, Jesus is a liar. Though, of course, defenders of the faith won't acknowledge that and will desperately try to make up some other excuse.
Again, I'm not really sure if the point here is to lie. And I'm not going to defend. I'm not going to defend any of this really. I'm just giving a different kind of take on it. Doesn't matter to me if Jesus was divine or not. Doesn't matter to me if Jesus existed or not. Doesn't matter if Christianity is true or not. It's just kind of an interesting scholarly exercise for me to think about it and compare it to other statements and belief systems. And I do feel like the intention is not necessarily to lie. Guru Nanak, he's kind of the father of Sikhism. He uh, openly expressed his beliefs and then was beaten in the street. And this is something that happens to quite a few people who come out and express a belief like, I am God, right? We generally consider those people to be insane and blasphemers at the same time. So, meanwhile, if we take Nanak as being kind of like the same type of figure as Jesus, in that they're both expressing the same kind of truth that, I and the Father are one. The individual self does not exist independently of the reality in which it exists, and thus the individual self doesn't exist as a separate entity of any kind, but it's all kind of wrapped up in this domain of God. Then what we see from both examples is that in expressing that belief, people in different times and different cultures are going to attack you and potentially kill you. So, is the purpose to lie, or is the purpose to spread the message and to spread the message in a way that is more profitable than saying it bluntly? Because while, saying it bluntly is the best option to any rational audience, it's not necessarily the best option to people who are engaged in irrational, or like that are irrational, that believe in superstitions, or that believe in sort of the separation of objects, that believe in themselves, perhaps, whatever would drive them to attack somebody because of their beliefs. We certainly see that a lot, even in today's society. For as progressive and open as our society is, there's still a lot of people who will become enraged because you disagree with them and then go on the offensive. So, is it wisdom that causes these people to take a step back and say, hey, you know what, if I just come out and say this, it's not going to end well. It's not going to be profitable at all. I want to spread this message, but I want to do it in a way that people are receptive to, and maybe not everybody gets it, but at least it will be out there.
It wasn't lies, it was just bullshit.
You have to distinguish fantasy from reality. And in the reading of this book, we have to assume that when the Bible says that God,
I guess one parallel with that is we teach students, like in K-12, we teach students kind of one version of the way things work, especially when it comes to chemistry. Then when they actually get into a post-grad education, they learn a more nuanced, complex system of the way that things work. When we're trying to explain string theory to lay people, we're talking about it as strings interacting, right? Or there's certain concepts that we dumb down or provide an analogy for to the uninitiated, because we think that it will be easier for them to understand and accept it than the more complicated, nuanced perspective that we understand. So I want to put that forward. Like there's some potential there that certain poets or religious authors use allegory, metaphors, similitudes, not as a means of deception, but as a means of simplifying the explanation. Certainly, Dante Alighieri used the anagogical interpretation in his works in the Divine Comedy, and that's written in the back pages of some of the copies of the Divine Comedy. Certainly, the one that I have mentions, it's a quote by Dante talking about anagogical interpretation of his works. So, for Dante, his Divine Comedy is not simply a story of Dante and Virgil ascending through the, you know, layers of hell, purgatory, and paradise, but there's more hidden within that story for the one who wants to understand it.
God keeps the snow in storehouses until he has to ship them off somewhere in the form of a storm, and that he has another warehouse just for keeping his arsenal of lightning bolts, because the book of Job really does say both of those things.
And I want to point again back to Alighieri. Think about how many copies of the Divine Comedy have been perpetuated, and the fact that it's still um, read today. And just think about that. Now, if Dante had come out and wrote some kind of philosophical treatise that bluntly stated his philosophy on things, would it still be as widely read? Would it still be used in popular culture? It's less likely. By couching his points of view in this allegory, it's, I think, gained more airtime, and more people are likely to understand it than if it had simply been rejected. If the Crusaders had of round up all the copies and burn them because they didn't like what it said.
Then, even if there was really a God who would certainly know better than all these things and wouldn't say anything that stupid, the real God cannot be the Bible God. When the Bible says that God said something stupid or hateful or dishonest, or when it shows God contradicting himself, then we have to stick to the story where the Bible God says things that are stupid, hateful, and contradictory and dishonest.
I think there's an element too of social mores because this is something I read in other religious books too, where God said to do something or God instructed people to do something, and it's usually very contextual. It's based off of their kind of social customs, right? So it's like to say, in today's world, you don't dead name people. God said, don't dead name people. It's not that God literally said don't dead name people, but people who understand the knowledge of God are inspired to realize that going against some social customs and social mores um, that are particularly influential during a certain period of time isn't necessarily advantageous. There's nothing to be gained from it. You might as well just, give unto Caesar what, pay Caesar his taxes when you're in Rome, right? Don't try to fight against it for because there's nothing to be gained by doing so.
And we have to remember that that wouldn't reflect on any real God. I mean, the Bible says that there was a worldwide flood, and we know for certain that that didn't happen, and nor the Tower of Babel either. And the same for a bunch of other silly fables of impossible absurdity that God says he did.
The actually, yeah, well, we know Epic of Gilgamesh, right? We know that the flood stories predate Christianity. Um, there's some kind of moral principle in there, metaphysical principle. It's allegorical in some way for sin, perhaps. Honestly, don't put a whole lot of effort into interpreting that story or many of the stories in the Bible. Um, More or less, the obvious ones are the ones that I focus on. Um, and I think that some of the stories in there, like when talking about Job, that some of the stuff sounds a little bit further out there. The magic that Jesus performed. Um, I'm not sure that those, if those are allegories, which more than likely they are, I'm not sure they're well constructed allegories. And again, my interest is not in literalism or in proving that the Bible is correct, but simply providing some kind of historical context to different interpretations. One thing going back to Richard Dawkins, I think this was kind of a turning point in my interest in religion was when he debated Alistair McGrath. And Alistair McGrath pointed out that Dawkins was kind of pigeonholing or strawmanning Christianity because he was focusing on what a certain subset of Christians in the United States, like particularly like the Southern Baptists, believe, and that he was tossing out all of these other perspectives, like figures like Saint John of the Cross, who had a dramatically different point of view. And Saint John of the Cross is a saint, right? Just as Saint Ignatius of Loyola was a saint, or Clement of Alexandria was a figure in the church, right? So all of these um, recognize, like individuals like Tertullian, Augustine, Saint Thomas Aquinas, all have very different theologies from these Baptists in the United States. So, but those are the ones that critics of religion, of Christianity in particular, like to focus on. And I took that, being a reasonable person, I can't hear that and not realize that that's true. And in a way, I lost some respect for Richard Dawkins. I think he's still a great scientist, a great geneticist, or whatever. And his theory of memetics is a really good theory. Um, However, and actually, I enjoyed the evil gene as well. However, I see how he has a kind of habitual. aversion to religion, a habitual hatred of it because of what he's been exposed to in in the United States and probably in various parts of Europe, and that contrast to him is what has informed his rejection or hatred of religion, which has kind of closed him off to these other perspectives.
So even if there was a God,
or maybe simply because Richard Dawkins made a career on it. I mean, the key element I think there is just his own sense of self, his own ego, and what the implications are of what Alistair McGrath was saying. That and Richard Dawkins profited through books and through speaking arrangements from maintaining this point of view.
Bible would still be wrong about all of that. No real God did any of that. The Bible God did that because the Bible God is just a character, a villain in his own story. Of course, he's the villain. He bragged that he was the one who created evil, that he's the one who brings darkness and disaster, and that besides him there is none.
Specifically, he says, "I created the darkness and formed the light." I created created evil and good. So what this is portraying again is this concept of non-duality, this concept that God does all of these things, that you can't point to any one particular thing that is not God, right? Look in the sky, you'll find me there. Look under a stone, you'll find me there. So again, and I created I created the darkness and formed the light. Is this concept of an all-encompassing, non-dual existence, that you can't have one without the other. And if I'm going to jump into Romans 9 here. Romans 9 is the section of the Bible that's famously cited by Calvinists and that everybody else in Christendom seems to reject, which is St. Paul, I believe, addressing the Romans, saying that hath not God power, or hath not the potter power over the clay of the same lump to make one vessel unto honor and another unto dishonor? What if God, willing to show his wrath, formed some vessels unto honor and some vessels unto destruction? And the way he's saying it is like, in order for God's glory to be known, his wrath has to be displayed at the same time. The only way for a conscious mind to conceive of God's glory is to also conceive of his wrath, to have that kind of contrast or contradictory experience, similar to the way that we perceive a dark, a black object on a white background. If we had a black object on a black background, we wouldn't see the object at all. It would appear not to exist. So in order for us to see that, we have to have this contrast, this duality. And this is more a statement about the human mind than it is about the objective reality out there. But effectively, we're not able to perceive anything unless there's something else beside it that we can compare it to. And so in Romans 9, he's quite clearly saying this is why God, this is why we experience God's glory and his wrath, is because that's the only way that he would actually be known.
None else, meaning there's no one else to blame. So anytime anything bad happens, God did it.
Absolutely. And if we're going with the mystical interpretation, anytime anything happens is because God did it.
Example, in another one of those stories that we know for certain really didn't happen, God had to cause all of this calamity to get Pharaoh to let his people go. But then God jumps over to the black side of the chessboard to harden Pharaoh's heart so that he could jump back to the white side again and kill a bunch of kids to get vengeance essentially against himself. And Pharaoh was just a pawn, as were we all, and God has no one else to play with.
Absolutely, that's the whole point. That's again covered in Romans 9, along with a few other stories. He says, "For Isaac have I loved, and Esau have I hated," or something along those lines. Um, the elder will teach the younger. A couple of different concepts in there that kind of imply that there's this causality inherent in things, which is equal to God's will, and that everything that happens is God's will. Um, he says, "Therefore, it is not of him that wills or him that runs, but of God that shows mercy." The Roman sign is really a rejection of the concept of free will and attributes all sovereignty to God. It's saying basically if human beings had any kind of free will of their own, that it would contradict God's sovereignty, and therefore it's believed that human beings do not have any kind of independence or free will. And this is why Calvinists who don't believe in free will, who reject that concept, focus so much on Romans 9 and the story of Pharaoh, because this is an example of God determining what Pharaoh's decision will be, and then casting these plagues on Egypt, right? The consequential nature of the plagues is in a way just to highlight that everything that happens is attributable to God. All the good and all the bad, all the wrath and all the glory is attributable to God. So even as horrendous, as horrific as those acts are, they are still attributable to God, and there's nobody else besides God, not even Pharaoh, and not even there's no evil entity out there. Jesus, or the kind of allegory of Lucifer, again ties in with the allegory, the Hammurabi's concept of the morning star, and you'll often see morning star and Lucifer used interchangeably in texts. Lucifer means light bringer, just like morning star was the star that rose in the morning to led the sun. So to give context to that, the original allegory being that the morning star rises into the morning sky and shines its light, but it's getting ahead of the sun and not realizing that, as the sun rises behind it, it's going to wash out the light from Venus or from the morning star, phosphorus. And that, so in its pride, you have to read Hammurabi. In its pride, it raced out into the morning sky, but then it was washed away by the sun. Similarly, Lucifer, or Satan, the adversary, attempts to distinguish itself from God and kind of laud its own will and its own accomplishments, and really focuses on its own ego, and that's what its primary sin was, and that will tie back into the story of Genesis.
Maybe God should make some friends because he is the only one who can literally make friends. So why not? Make a friend and give him equal powers for a chance at mutual respect. If Genie could do that for Jafar, then God could do that too. I can do anything, right? Until it comes to raising money or building something or spreading his word out there, because then Mr. Omnipotent is suddenly disabled and needs us to do his work for him.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, like, if people don't have free will, like Romans 9 suggests, then everything that we do is God's doing. So it would not only use us to do those things, but is us doing those things. And I mentioned the Bhagavad Gita earlier. It has a similar statement in it to Romans 9, where it says the one in the enlightened state realizes that while he's sleeping, breathing, eating, evacuating, and so forth, that he really does nothing, and that it is God that merely acts through him. I guess you could say that we're all puppets in the hands of some. Well, how did Einstein say it? We all dance to the tune intoned in the distance by a mysterious piper. Again, these are just allegories, right? But Einstein's allegory of the mysterious piper kind of deciding our fates is similar in kind to the Bhagavad Gita talking about Brahman doing all of the eating, sleeping, evacuating, and so forth, or Romans 9 talking about God afore preparing some vessels unto glory and some vessels unto destruction. Or, in fact, the Buddha says something very similar about potters and clay.
So maybe a real God wouldn't lie, but all the mythical gods of every religion can and very often do, according to the various fables and folklore written about them. The Bible is no exception. For example, El, Allah, Abba, Yahweh, Jehovah, Santos, Devolder, whatever his name was that day, he said that no man may look upon him and live.
A couple things here. It's Jehovah or Yahweh is an anglicization of the Tetragrammaton, which is 4 characters of the Hebrew alphabet. I believe I may not be pronouncing them correctly, but they're Yud Hai Vav Hai, and the exact meaning of those characters is not known. But if a lot of the Hebrew interpretation suggests that individual characters have their own meaning and their own numerical value, especially when you get into the Kabbalah traditions of like Isaac Luria and those guys. They believed that each individual character had its own meaning and its own numerical value. So that kind of opens up the idea that this tetragrammaton could have a number of different meanings. It could be a name, it could be an acronym, or it could be a mathematical equation, or something else entirely. Most scholars translate it into something like being, or the ground of being, or I guess the fact of being, right? And so this kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about concepts of totality or concepts of completeness existing in the ancient world, and whether or not it was obvious to people then that there was this kind of all-encompassing thing, this set that contains all sets, or kind of universe theory, I guess, metaverse theory, whatever you want to call it, the cosmos, nature. They certainly, all these words have different origins. Like if we, existence is a old French term, reality is Latin, um, God is Proto-Indo-European, comes from a word meaning to libate or to pour. It's pie gut, and so on and so forth. So, did they choose pie gut, meaning to libate or to pour, because they saw that as being a form of causation, which ties into God or Jehovah, or the Tetragrammaton meaning being? You see, like there's some kind of similarity between those concepts, and it's not entirely clear how they got from one to the other, but it's clear that they do have similarities, and they also have similarities with these other words, right? Like existence simply means to present an appearance, to appear, right? So is something appearing, is that what we mean by being? If something has being, then it appears. If it's real, then it's, you see, there's this problem of synonyms in these definitions, right? If you open a dictionary and you say define existence, it's going to say the state of being real, which then if you ask for a definition of real, it's going to say having existence. So we end up in this loop of using synonyms to define words instead of actually providing a clear definition. Like a typical definition, what makes a definition and not a synonym is that it's relying on a collection of other concepts to explain that concept. So, for example, a table is a flat surface um, propped up by four legs or something, right? Like, you're not going to say that a table is a table or a synonym for a table. You need to give some kind of explanation of what it is that uses different concepts that make up a table, or somehow it's in contrast to what a table is. Um, Whereas when we get into defining things like reality or being, we end up using synonyms. And some of those synonyms are existence, reality, being. Actual is one that comes up a lot. And you'll often see in these quote unquote definitions a whole bunch of synonyms in one sentence. So we'll say reality is the state of actually existing. Well, actual and existing are kind of the same thing. Existing and reality are kind of the same thing, and so on and so forth. So it's clear just by looking at these terms in a typical dictionary that we don't actually have a definition of what any of these things are, except to say that it's something that encompasses everything else. It's like the set contains all sets, or the ontological superiority. And I'm saying that because that's effectively the ontological argument, right? The argument put forth by Tertullian, I think, was the first to put it forth, and then again defended by Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas. This concept that God is the ontologically superior being that encompasses and contains all being, and then is sometimes referred to as the ground of being, which is the scholarly translation of the Tetragrammaton. So I've also heard, and the sources of proof here are a little bit slim, but I've read that the the meaning of the Hebrew characters is something to the effect of to cause, to become, and to unbecome, and that into which things become. So we're saying effectively this anthropological pattern mentioned by Pope Benedictus, the being from, being for, and being with, and then ending, the termination of a thing too, the beginning of something, the subsistence of something, the end of something, and that unto within which it subsists, is effectively what those four characters could mean. Though it's not really clear from the Wikipedia articles on it what it is. I've read that somewhere, but I couldn't tell you exactly where I read that. It seems like a plausible concept when you consider how the name is generally translated into English, and then the other terms like God that were chosen to mimic it. But so you have Yud Hai Vav Hai, which are the Hebrew characters represented in Arabic, or in kind of our English characters as JHVH or YHWH, and then you inject some vowels in there and you get Jehovah or Yahweh. That's essentially what it is, but the original name applied to it is not a name per se, but more like an acronym of Hebrew characters, each with their own meaning.
If God had no power over that. And indeed, the Gospel of John says something similar, that no man had ever seen God, not at any time. So was God lying about that?
Oh, right. And this point, is a similar theme in Buddhism, where you have this concept of the Buddha, which is the all-pervading reality that the bhikkhu or the monk seeks to attain to. And at one point in the suttas, Siddhartha Gautama, the original Buddha, is attributed as saying that in attaining enlightenment, the body dies, the mind dies, there's nothing left of the individual to identify. So effectively, when you become Buddha, you're done, you're gone. So you could never actually experience Buddha nature, because if you were to dissolve your ego enough to actually experience the Buddha nature, then you wouldn't have an ego to experience it. And for that reason, the the Buddha, the quote unquote the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, was not the Buddha. He was a bodhisattva, which is somebody who glimpses the truth, that glimpses the true Buddha nature, but then remains an ego, and as effectively remains in a fallen state. So that's an important concept in Buddhism and in Christianity, this concept that the closer you get to God, the less you get to God, the less you there is to get there. And if you were to go there completely, you wouldn't exist. So it's of necessity that nobody could ever really perceive God, because they wouldn't be perceiving it.
Is John lying about that? Well, both are, because the Bible already says early on that several people had already seen God and lived. Adam saw God walking in the garden. Abraham recognized his face as one of three men who came to his door. The other two were
The other thing, sometimes people will say in various religions that whenever they see anything, they're seeing God, because God is this all-pervading thing that manifests in various ways, manifests as good and evil, manifests as young and old, as basically effectively everybody and everything. Means that for some kind of more romanticized theologies, that they see God in everything. Look in the sky and you'll find me there. Look under a stone and you'll find me there. This kind of idea that you can see God literally everywhere, including in other people. But we should also consider that maybe some of these stories are allegorical, like the Garden of Eden story, which we'll get into hopefully shortly, is such an allegory. It seems that God is characterized as having a physical presence. But again, this is allegory, and I think that the majority of scholarly Christians or mystics would reject the idea that God is a body of that sort. Certainly, the ontological argument of Tertullian rejects that, and that's clarified in Aquinas' Summa Theologica, in which he responds to objections to the ontological argument, and he says, it is clear that not everyone has, or it is clear that some people have believed God to be a body, but that effectively that the ontological argument disproves that. Because if God was a body, then God would not be that than which nothing greater can be thought, to use the exact phraseology. I believe it's reply to objection 2, Summa Theologica. The ontological argument is formulated as that than which nothing greater can be thought. So there's something larger, more encompassing, some greater ontological reality. If God was a body, then that would clearly not be God, because that would not be the greatest ontological reality, or the greatest conceivable thing. In that case, the universe or reality or existence would clearly be the bigger thing, since the universe as the whole, or reality as a whole, can't be said to be a body. it may have several visible bodies within it, like planets moving around and things like that, or swirling whirlwinds or whatever. And each one of those things may be an aspect of God or an aspect of the universe, but the universe as a whole is not really uh, a bounded body. It doesn't have the same kind of boundaries as we think of when we think of a body.
The angels who went down to Sodom while God sat under a tree and ate lunch with Abraham. Jacob had to have seen God because they got into a wrestling match and they wrestled all night long. The interpretation is that God didn't really touch Jacob in the hollow of the thigh. I mean, not like that. And it wasn't really God either, but an angel disguised as God, a representative of God, like God's stand-in stunt double. We don't know what angel it was. It was wrestling with Jacob, who then lied and said they were God. Maybe that angel was Katara Ravash. So God lied later.
I just realized that I've been talking for a while here. I forgot to continue recording. This is all kind of just going over the same stuff over and over again. So I think I'm just going to let him talk for a bit until we get to the Genesis part. It should be coming
On,
up.
and the author of this chapter, or that one, must have lied too. Wouldn't be the last time, because you've got all these prophets speaking for God, like Isaiah and Ezekiel, and they got everything wrong. And it wasn't the first time God lied either. Practically everything God ever says is wrong, right from the very beginning. Remember when what he said to Adam? He put two magical trees in the middle of the garden, and the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And that's obviously just a fable with a moral about the results of choices made or actions taken. But
So that's not obvious. This is what I've been waiting all this time to get to kind of explain my thesis here, which is that people do interpret this story differently. Some people interpret it as a story of obedience and disobedience to God, and they consider the original sin to be an act of disobedience to God because God said, don't eat from this tree, but they did anyway. I think it's important to consider these other interpretations. One being that since Adam and Eve didn't, they were eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, means that they didn't really comprehend good and evil prior to eating from this tree. So they wouldn't have known that it was bad to disobey God, and they wouldn't have known that it was good to obey God. They wouldn't have any concept of good or evil prior to consuming this fruit. So it seems unlikely based on that the point of the story is that they disobeyed God, because given everything else we've already talked about, how the Bible basically rejects the concept of free will in Romans 9, and the story of Pharaoh and God hardening Pharaoh's heart, and the fact that all these other things mentioned in the Bible are a rejection of free will, it seems unlikely that Adam and Eve wouldn't have disobeyed God. I think that was kind of inevitable. What's important about the story is what's not mentioned here. At least I don't. Well, I'll finish playing it, but I don't think he mentions it.
Some people miss the whole point of the story by reading it literally and when they can't understand metaphor. However, still, within the confines of the fable, God told Adam not to eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, for if he ever did, then on that day Adam would surely die.
Yeah, so I'm pretty sure he doesn't really cover the whole story here, but we'll get to the concept of dying in a minute. The thing that happens to Adam and Eve immediately after they eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is they become aware of their own nudity. They become cognizant of their own physical bodies. So presumably before that, they didn't have consciousness of their own physical boundaries. They didn't know they were naked. They didn't know that they lacked a certain sense of self-awareness. They were effectively like the other animals in the kingdom in that they didn't think about themselves in this way. They were probably, driven, like, you can interpret this as an allegory for evolution, how they started off as basically like other mammals that were responding more to stimulus response type mechanisms, maybe a certain level of socialization, although I think when we look at most social mammals, they do have a rudimentary sense of self. Um, but in this story, there's this stark contrast between the Adam before he eats the fruit and the Adam after he eats the fruit, in which he becomes not only aware of himself, but he also becomes self conscious. He becomes embarrassed, and they both pick up fig leaves to cover their genitals with because they're embarrassed. So, the important thing, really, in this story is this event and not the preceding allegory which leads up to it. The allegory is simply there to describe how having the knowledge of good and evil makes Adam and Eve self-conscious and embarrassed, and makes them aware of their own physical nudity. So what's important about this is that, as we were talking about earlier, the concept of good and evil is really a concept of duality, and the concept of self and God is really a concept of duality. So in eating from the tree, the knowledge of good and evil, they acquired this dualistic consciousness, recognizing themselves in contrast to everything else. It was really an allegory for the evolution of self consciousness and how that specifically forms the basis of sin, not the disobedience, because they didn't really have the free will to choose not to do what they did. Um, but after they acquired this sense of duality, then they became aware of themselves and became ashamed. And then when you think about this from a psychological point of view, it would not be possible to be ashamed without having a self concept. And when we look at creatures that don't have a self concept, they also lack shame. So, continuing on with this line of thinking, we can also see how the other deadly sins tie back into self consciousness. Envy, greed, gluttony, these are, again, related to self reflective thought, um, comparing what you have to what somebody else has, comparing what you have to what you don't have, and doing these types of reflections based off of self awareness is not only biblically makes more sense as the root of sin than the concept of disobedience, but also logically makes sense. And when you study sociology and look at these concepts through a sociological lens, they have a striking resemblance. The idea that people who have low self esteem respond to things in one way, and people with high self esteem respond to things in another way. Quote unquote narcissism, people with high self esteem reject threats to their own self. They want to puff themselves up with positive attributes and to reject any kind of negative attributes. And that's all about their own self consciousness, right? People with low self esteem is the same thing, even though they don't think highly of themselves, it's still a self reflective way of thinking. And then you have this concept, certain sociologists like Leary and Tagney and Hoyle and these social interactionists put out there, which is this concept of a flow state or of hypoegoic self-regulation, in which self-focus is reduced to a point where an individual feels like they're in harmony with their environment and they're just acting according to sort of an unconscious flow state, which is similar in ways to how people describe submitting to the will of God, reducing the focus on self or selfishness and submitting to the will of God, realizing effectively that they don't have an independent existence and that their ego is not in control, and they submit to God's will not through obedience to some set of rules, but through a reduction of self focus, a reduction of self conscious thinking. And that's more or less the theories of the mystics. That's what mysticism is. It's not a superficial or superstitious belief in demons and fairies and wisps and things like that. It's in nearly every case when we're talking about the mystics, we're talking about a group of people who um, who are effectively non-dualists. They accept that duality is a representation of an underlying non-dual existence, that the self as we experience it self-consciously is just one part of a duality, and that there is an underlying non-duality that supervenes on it. And then the path to liberation, or the path towards enlightenment, or whatever you want to call it, is reducing the focus on self, perceiving the underlying unity, and living within it, which could also be given as submission to God's will, or submission to the universe's will, or causality, or logic, let's say.
And the serpent comes along and says, Ye shall not surely die, for God doth know that in the day you eat thereof, then your eyes will be opened, and ye shall be.
And their eyes were open to self awareness, but they died in a different sense, because now they're trapped in their own egotism. Now they've lost the spirit, so to speak. They're no longer in harmony with God or with the universe, but now they are isolated to their own egotistical perspective on the world, their own narcissism, their own self consciousness. And this is, it's kind of like Thomas Metzinger's concept of the ego tunnel, right? This idea that we don't consciously experience the world as it is. We consciously experience the world as we are. We experience it through the lens of our own ego, and not the way that it actually is. It's only from our vantage point, or our perspective. And he also talks about this shared manifold, where we all kind of perceive reality in similar ways based off of having similar egos, and therefore there's a shared manifold where we we agree on some things, whether they're objectively true or not. We experience it similar ways, so we agree on that by and large. Free will is a great example of that. We have kind of this intuitive experience of being in control of our own actions. So, for the most part, human beings agree that we have free will. And some philosophers, some scientists, some religious theologians disagree with that. But for the most part, most human beings seem to agree that we have free will, and that it's not really a contestable hypothesis. I know from having this conversation with hundreds, if not thousands, of people that I've maybe talked to one or two people that would seriously question the concept of free will, and everybody else just kind of blindly accepts it. And not only blindly accepts it, but they attribute it to God or they attribute it to quantum mechanics or something. Neither of which I think has any credibility, given what we've already talked about in the Bible. And then physics is a different thing. But point being that here's this shared manifold of self-consciousness, of this shared ego tunnel, where the majority of people seem to think that they have this thing, and therefore everybody kind of accepts it ipso facto, and few people even really challenge it. In fact, when you do challenge it, they think it's quite odd that you're even challenging it. And I remember years ago, TVO, Steve Pakin's The Agenda had a kind of debate where they debated the concept of free will. I think it might have been partially prompted by me harassing them on their forums to talk about it. But I think the question was very odd to everybody on the panel, and it wasn't really clear the way Pakin was asking it what was even being asked. One of the speakers, like the foremost speaker on the program, was the author of The Brain That Changes Itself, Norman Doidge. And of course, the book, The Brain That Changes Itself, implies this concept of free will. And Norman Doidge believed that free will was somehow baked into the neurons in the brain or something. So this question was asked, and it was asked mainly of some kind of legal expert, like a lawyer or somebody, and then it was asked of these neuroscientists that, besides Norman Deutsch, these other neuroscientists. And the neuroscientists didn't seem to really get what the question even was until it was clarified to them, and then they said, well, if you're asking whether or not human brains are chemical processes, then the answer is yes. If you're asking if there's something besides the human brain that makes decisions, then the answer is no. So they kind of agreed, at least in principle, that human beings didn't have free will, but they didn't seem to really understand the philosophical debate around free will. Meanwhile, the legal expert, basing his judgments on the fundamental principles of justice as they're enshrined in Canadian law, basically rejected the idea that there would be any other truth out there, that like we absolutely have to have free will, because how else would you hold people accountable? Which again, it's like we could debate that topic for the next couple of hours. I think it's actually the other way around, and that it doesn't really make any sense that you could hold somebody accountable unless they were the cause of the action. And then if we're presupposing that events follow from causes, then it would also follow from that presupposition that they were caused to make that decision in some way, right? But there seems to be this kind of blind spot when it comes to people's decisions, where we go, okay, well, here's their genetics and their upbringing, their socialization, the environmental factors, all the bullying that they experienced as a kid, the fact that they got fired from this job, the fact that this person rejected them, rejected their advances or whatever, and all these things contribute to our understanding of a person's motive. But then we have this blind area where we say they exercise their free will, and that kind of interrupts the causality that we understand at play. and then it continues again on from that as them being the cause of whatever event occurred, right? So if they, if they stole something from work, like, yeah, maybe they were impoverished, maybe they had some kind of neurological disorder that caused them to, steal things. Maybe they developed this kleptomania. It's just like they got away with it and they couldn't help themselves and kept doing it. Um, so we can understand motive, and we present motive as part of our case against them in court. We say, these are the reasons why they did it, and this was the effect that their actions caused. So we have this full chain of causality, except for this critical point where the decision is made, and then we've got this, kind of concept of free will or something, some self-caused nonsense going on there, right? And so, but that's what this lawyer was suggesting, is that you, in order for people to be accountable for their actions, that they had to have free will, which, like I say, makes no sense, because the fact that they caused the action is what makes them accountable. They can still be held to account as being the principal cause of that action, even if there are, tertiary historical influences and things that ultimately made them do it. They're still the reason. And to put it in another context, if you are, say you're driving your car down the road and then you blow a wheel out and the car comes to a grinding halt, as the rims are shooting out sparks and stuff, you would realize that a number of things could have caused this to happen. Maybe there was a manufacturing defect in the sidewall. Maybe you drove over a nail or something. Maybe there's some reason why the tire blew out. But as far as you getting back on the road, you got to address the missing tire, right? So it's really kind of irrelevant at that point what the reasons are for why the tire exploded. The main thing to focus on in terms of getting back on the road is getting that tire replaced. And in that same way, in criminal justice, if the goal of criminal justice is to protect people, to rehabilitate crime, or to rehabilitate criminals, to reduce recidivism, um, to have these desirable effects, then the causes that happened 10, 15 years in their past are not really relevant to those goals, except insofar as maybe rehabilitation would take into consideration these causes in order to provide an effective form of therapy or effective form of treatment of the criminal mindset. And this is a whole other topic, but this is a view proposed by the famous ACLU lawyer Clarence Darrow, who, famous for the Scopes monkey trials and the Leopold and Loeb case. And this is a point of view that he took in the Leopold and Loeb case, that although Leopold and Loeb were affluent Jewish Americans, they were privileged, they were white, they came from wealth, that this privilege, this this wealth, meant that they got away with a lot of things, that there was very little accountability for them in their lives, and they could do things like they could skip school or cheat on their exams, and they'd still get to push through because of the culture. And on top of that, war and death were being normalized through global conflicts. And so, for these reasons, Darrow thought that the minds of these men were corrupted externally, and that's what led to their crime. So, Darrow really thought that individual crime was attributable to extant factors, and that, ultimately, you still have to acknowledge that their minds were corrupted and their minds needed to be treated in some way. So he wrote this book called Crime, Its Cause, and Its Treatment, where he kind of fleshes out these ideas. But the general notion being that you don't actually need free will to have a criminal justice system, to hold people accountable, to rehabilitate crime, to punish people when needed, to punish them for a deterrent, to punish them, even if you're considering the social impact, because people want to see justice done or whatever. That's a consideration you can take into account as well, right? Because that is an effect of a cause, right? There's a cause and effect relationship between all these things. So, and again, I think that it's kind of axiomatically true when you there's an excellent paper out there by Wesley Salmon called Causality and Explanation, which kind of explains all this in a lot more detail than I can here, but it describes how all explanation is inherently causal, and that when you break with causality, as in the case of free will, you're not really providing any kind of an explanation. It's just a blank area, it's like a God of the gaps argument, if you will. It's putting free will in with along with a whole bunch of causal mechanisms and expecting that somehow that changes the result. It's like adding a zero to to a bunch of addition or something, right? It doesn't change anything. You got 5 plus 5 plus 5 is equal to 15. If you add a plus 0 in the end, it's still 15, right? I mean, the, putting free will in there doesn't actually get you anywhere. It doesn't add any further explanation to a person's decisions. All it really does is justify punitive punishment for the sake of punishment. It justifies malice towards him. And then, in terms of our own experience, like this thing called the fundamental attribution error, or this another one, the self-serving bias, whereby we preferentially attribute positive effects to our own character, our own free will, and then we attribute negative effects to somebody else's free will. Or if it's something we've done that's shameful, then we attribute it to external factors, right? I only did it because I was caused to do it by all these different things. But the reason that that person did it was because of their free will. Or I succeeded because of my free will. They succeeded because of all of these circumstantial factors, right? So this is a well-known thing in psychology, and this is all kind of plays into this self-conscious ego that we have, that is kind of the core of sin, right? The core of us being sinful is our self-consciousness, our comparison with other people, the way we selectively attribute causation to ourselves and others, and how we basically ignore our relationship to God, or I mean, in a modern context, we could say our relationship to the universe. And to drive that point home more and finish off this recording, is if we look at neuroscience, which I mentioned earlier, it's largely accepted that our ego is an activation pattern in our brain. That what we think of as ourselves is basically the integrated output of neural networks in our cortex, and that if you were to remove certain parts of that brain, then we would deplete or diminish certain aspects of our ego at the same time. There's the bodily awareness, which is subject to a lack of sensitivity, like in the case of alien hand syndrome or something like that, where we disidentify with a portion of our body. That's kind of covering the physical boundaries, but there's also the psychological boundaries, where people with schizophrenia might hear voices. They might not identify with their own internal narrative and then think that somebody else is talking to them. If you've ever I have this thing where it seems like whenever I get into the shower, I remember something that my dad said to me when I was a kid about showering and how to properly shower. And it's like I'm old enough to know how to clean myself, and yet for some reason I can still kind of hear his voice telling me what to do. Um, where I recognize it as just like a recurring memory that's relevant to the situation, but somebody who's suffering from identity disorder may not recognize that as their own internal thinking. Um, so this is a way in which the ego becomes fragmented. And actually, a great book is Todd Feinberg's Altered Egos, where he talks about these altered ego states in clinical psychology and clinical neurology. And there's quite a few interesting states like that, where a person's sense of self breaks down or misidentifies with something else. Or in the case of dissociative identity disorder, where they identify as multiple different people depending on their moods or whatever. And all of this is just to say that yes, we are, as Francis Crick says, we are our brains. And Crick wrote this book. He titled it "The Astonishing Hypothesis." Astonishing hypothesis. He believed, like um, like everybody else, that this idea that we are our brains, that our ego is an activation pattern in our brains, and that we don't exist as some other kind of entity. He believed that this was astonishing. That this was something that wasn't immediately obvious to people, and is still not really obvious to people. And this is the same kind of realization as the mystics, as many of them express. This realization that their ego is not a thing. It's not its own thing. It's somehow just a pattern in nature. It's just a manifestation of God or whatever, and that it doesn't have any kind of independent existence or subsistent quality to it, but that it's subject to circumstances, really. Um, and so, if Francis Crick thought this was astonishing, then it's reasonable that somebody in 3500 BC would have been just as astonished by it, by that realization, and maybe would have worded it differently or framed it differently. Maybe they didn't attribute it to the brain. Maybe they attribute it to the heart or the liver or something. But it was the same kind of thinking as what Francis Crick had. So, and as we know, Francis Crick, co-discoverer of the helical structure of DNA along with Watson, and went on to study the neural correlates of consciousness with Christoph Koch, and came to this hypothesis along with, kind of before his research with Koch, but along the same lines. A lot of representational neuroscientists think along the same lines now. Not only that, but our visual representation of our own bodies, of our own minds, is a construction of our brains. We don't perceive anything that isn't filtered through our brains. Like, everything we perceive as being objective reality is really just something in our ego tunnel, something that's part of our representational hierarchy that we're manifesting through the organizational structure of our brains. And in that sense, like, if we were somehow able to get outside of our brains, we wouldn't we wouldn't be able to. effectively. We're not able to get outside of our brains. We're not able to perceive reality as it is, but only through our ego. And in the same way that we talk about people not being able to perceive God, um, that, like as Gautama says, you can't become enlightened and still remain an individual. You can't experience God while being alive, right? You can't experience the universe while being a brain. It just kind of makes sense, right? You can only experience the universe through your particular representation of it, even if it is shared with a bunch of other people. You could never prove that they see it exactly the way you do. In any case, you can't prove that everybody perceives color exactly the same way. People could very easily perceive color differently. In fact, a fascinating story. I had a friend that was well into his 20s, and we were going out for lunch somewhere. While we were colleagues, we worked together. We were going out for lunch somewhere, and I looked over at a field of grass, and I said, "It's pretty cool how the green and yellow blend together." And he had no idea what I was talking about. He says, "What are you talking about? All I see is green." And this was the first time in this person's life that they became aware that they were colorblind. They were well into their 20s before they became aware that they were colorblind, which just goes to show you that, I mean, it seems unbelievable, but it goes to show you that communicating differences of experience like that are very, very difficult. And even though we both might look at something and say it's blue, our experience of blue might be totally unique to ourselves. And yet, we have this shared manifold, which is that we both agree that it's blue, but really what we mean by blue is entirely wrapped up in our own ego tunnel. So I think a lot of this stuff just ties into religion, and particularly the mystic interpretation of religion. People think that the mystics are, into superstition. They're into angels and demons. But this is not what I get from any quote unquote mystics, like the ones that I've mentioned. Their their theologies, their belief systems sound more to me like what is revealed through science, and even a lot of like the mainstream religion, when you unpack it, when you get rid of when you separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak, it ends up being very, very similar. Seems like everybody like, so then there's this concept of the Tower of Babel, which again is more allegory. It's the idea that the more languages you have, the harder it is for people to understand each other. The more philosophies you have, the harder it is for people to understand each other. We think that there's opposition where there's no opposition. We think that the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama are dramatically different from the teachings of the uh, the Vedas, but they're not. The Gautama's philosophy is inspired by his Vedic background, right? So they're not effectively different. And the same with Jainism, Taoism are kind of offshoots of Buddhism, and then you've got these other religions. They all tie together. And there's groups out there like the Baha'i, the Sikhs, that see the commonality in these different religions and they embrace all of them. So if you read the Siri Guru Granth Sahib, the Sikh holy text, it's quite long. There's a lot of different authors in it, but it's this everything that I've said here about the mystics is actually stated quite plainly in the Guru Granth Sahib. There's very little doubt in that text that this is their philosophy or that this is their theology, and yet they're drawing on both Hinduism and Islam to get to these conclusions. So I fail to see how literalism, in the sense of what Aaron Raw is talking about or Richard Dawkins was talking about, is the full account of religion or is even an adequate account of religion. I think it's kind of a straw man. It's kind of geographically focused. It's based in a lot of what a lot of really small-minded people think that are not the contemplative types. They're not the scholarly or priestly types. And I want to emphasize in Corinthians, um, Corinthians says that basically priestly study is the highest act of devotion. That contemplation, studying the written works, these are of greater value to the pursuit of the knowledge of God than is other things like speaking in tongues or singing hymns. While singing hymns and speaking in tongues are acts of devotion, therefore, at least the person's kind of got their foot in the door. Again, that concept of having their foot in the door. These aren't really as valuable as contemplation. And we find that in the um, various monasteries, the monks like the Byzantine and Trappist, and the Opus Dei, and these other groups that contemplation, inward reflection, trying to understand the relationship of self to God is the key act of devotion that they practice in the United States proper, in the parenchyma of the United States is mostly about singing hymns and putting coins in plates and things like that. But this is on the same level as speaking in tongues, right? Like it's not a contemplative act as much as it is, like, especially prayer. Like the way I was taught to pray was mainly about asking for stuff, right? Give me, I want to have a new car, so I'm going to pray for a new car. I'm going to pray for a promotion at work. But contemplative prayer is anything but that. It's more or less, if you're asking for anything, it's being asked to be freed of your own narcissism, which is the contrary of asking for material wealth and success and things like that. So again, I just want to encourage people to consider the broader context of religion, consider who the mystics actually were, and what their beliefs actually were. Hopefully, I've given enough references and explanation that it's got some of your wheels spinning. Have a good one.